Former President Jacob Zuma was back in court today in a bid to have his legal costs paid for in full. Thulasizwe Simelane, our senior political reporter, has been covering that story. He joins us now. Thulas, so let's talk through what happened in court today. Why did this withdrawal of the application essentially take place?
So, Joe, this has to do with the cost order that was made in relation to the former president's attempt to block the release of the state capture report before it came out, of course, which when it went to court, basically the court had a dim view of even that attempt to block that state capture report. And I guess in a way to sort of send a strong message to the former president, who was no stranger to litigation that some would say was frivolous, basically the court then came to a conclusion to say the costs have to be borne by the president, the then president, in his personal capacity. So it's specifically about that, the costs of that matter. He's trying to get out of paying those costs, which some have estimated at about 10 million rand or so. And today was really about, of course, a lot has happened since then. When President Cyril Ramaphosa came into office, he indicated earlier on this month that he's basically not going to pursue this appeal against this cost order, and therefore, from the presidency side of things, that was the end of the matter. So today was really about the former president now, Jacob Zuma. Can he, initially there was an indication that he wanted to enter the proceedings as a party to the proceedings, because remember, up until now he's not been a party in his personal capacity. It was the president versus all the other parties. And so there was initially indication that he wanted to join in as a party himself, then to be able to then appeal the costs, despite the fact that the presidency has said we are not appealing. So that's what today was really about. It was a technical hearing, which really centered around when the president, Ramaphosa, announced on the 6th that we are not appealing and made that announcement. Was the matter withdrawn by virtue of that announcement and the communication that then followed with the various legal representatives of the various other parties, or did the withdrawal become effective on the 10th when the state attorney's representative went to the court to lodge papers to say we are withdrawing our application for leave to appeal? Or was the appeal effective today when they all assembled there and basically had this argument? But in the end, there was a sort of amicable balance that was then found.
It's a hard one to get your head around when you think about all the cases and the cost issues. So what is the presidency paying for at this point, and what is the former president paying for in his personal capacity as it stands?
So in relation to this particular case, the cost order against former President Jacob Zuma stands simply by, the order that says he must pay the costs of that application to block the release of the state capture report. That stands as things stand now, because the presidency, on whose behalf he was acting when he said we would want to appeal, has withdrawn their appeal, and former President Jacob Zuma is not a party to these proceedings, so therefore he was not represented in court. He didn't have counsel today representing him in court, and therefore there was no argument of him joining the proceedings at this stage. So if he still intends to appeal that cost order, I guess he's going to have to now bring in a fresh application, because from those who had brought this application, the presidency, they've withdrawn it, and the High Court in Pretoria has allowed the presidency to withdraw and made a cost order that related to the costs of today's hearing. Because of the complexities, it ended up with a situation where, despite the announcement by the presidency that we intend to withdraw the application for leave to appeal, the advocates did show up in court today because of a complexity in the way that was handled, and therefore there needed to be a determination of who pays for the costs of today's hearing. And in the end, the agreement that was reached, that the judge said, is that the presidency pays for the costs of today's hearing, and the presidency is allowed to withdraw their application for leave to appeal, meaning the original order that says Jacob Zuma pays in his personal capacity stands.
All right, so let me ask you a question about Jacob Zuma's legal representation. It was interesting not to see Michael Hulley in court.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had to rewind and sort of think about all the court cases, and, you know, former President Jacob Zuma has had a plethora of court cases that have played themselves out. I go back to around 2005 or even earlier possibly to try and find a case where Michael Hulley was not really at the forefront, at the very least, and I'm not claiming to know each and every case who was the instructing attorney, but certainly he's been the attorney of record for Jacob Zuma for at least 15 years thereabout. And so to see and have a letter read out by a different attorney, I think his or her name is Manji, that sent a letter to say, we've just received instructions to act on behalf of former President Jacob Zuma in this particular matter, was an interesting one, and it will be an interesting thread to pull at to say what's happening here. We don't really know what the official explanation is at this point, but we certainly will be asking the questions to say, what's happening here? He's been the attorney of record for at least, if I'm not mistaken, about 13, 14 years.
Interesting indeed. Does it end here, or can Jacob Zuma take this particular issue to a higher court?
He can, and from the arguments that I heard today, he certainly would have to bring his own application in his own personal capacity, because the institution that he represented, that is the presidency, has certainly said they are not appealing that costs order. There's a lot of interest for him to do that, because, you know, if the figures being mentioned are accurate, 10 million rand is not a small amount for him to pay in his personal capacity. So he would probably have a lot of interest to do that. We'll have to, I guess now it's a matter of the next move is his to decide, does he appeal in his personal capacity? Given also the other legal challenges that he faces, does he have appetite to fight this other battle now to say, I don't want to pay these costs? Remember, in a separate matter, the 16 charges that he faces of fraud, corruption, racketeering, and money laundering that emanate from 783 counts, are back to life now, and he's going to be attending to those matters, even though in that regard there's that political agreement that was reached between the presidency, state attorney, and Mr. Jacob Zuma to sort of help him with those costs. But I think he's got a lot to think about. What capacity does he have to continue to wage this Stalingrad approach to litigation that he has had, with the backing of the state's coffers for all these years?
All right, Thulasizwe Simelane, you've unpacked that for us so comprehensively. Thank you very much for that.